questions. Charlotte, will you please give Donald Spivack your card? Yes. He's a really good guy to be in the loop with you.
I would like to be in the loop with you too. But
yeah, everyone here needs to be in the loop, but Donald Spivack, who I'm about to introduce, Donald Spivack is former Deputy Director of Policy and Operations for the Community Redevelopment Agency of Los Angeles. So he spent about 25 years actively guiding development in downtown Los Angeles for the Community Redevelopment Agency. So he's an utter genius. I've interviewed him a lot on my podcasts. If you go to our podcast page and look at interviews with him, I've got several interviews still coming up. Donald, I just did an interview with, I'm going to publish it next week. I just did an interview with Donald about the pedestrian walkways of Bunker Hill, which is a really, it's a fun interview, yeah, it's a lot of fun. So, Donald, I'd like to introduce you. We're going to get started on this walk, but we've had some email exchanges about the notion of carrots and sticks on Broadway. Could you just give us, you've lived it, man, you know exactly what, so just give us 10 minutes on oh, come on, you do this without thinking. Historic preservation on Broadway, carrots and sticks.
Good afternoon, everybody. Broadway is an important part of downtown Los Angeles. Historically was the downtown commercial center, and over time evolved as being both a retail and theater district. It's historically designated as a commercial and theater district, having been where many of the live performance theaters were built, long before Hollywood emerged as an entertainment center. And many of the buildings were built as relatively long-term buildings that were expected to be there for a long period of time. As the city grew, particularly in the post-war period, as people moved out of the city of Los Angeles, followed by business moving out of the city of Los Angeles, a number of the buildings were abandoned as being obsolete, not meeting modern needs for commerce, modern needs for office functions, modern needs for almost anything. The theaters themselves were designated as being obsolete as entertainment evolved away from large theaters to small, compact theaters with multi-screens that these theaters could not be easily adapted to. And since about half of them were actually designed as movie theaters, they were not easily adaptable to try to bring live entertainment back into them as an alternative. That was one of the options that was looked at. Over the course of many years, as the buildings were abandoned, there were a number of efforts made to try to bring activity back into Broadway. Starting in the 1980s, the City of Los Angeles put together the city's first business improvement district on Broadway, which was an association at that time of business operators. It was predated most of the more recent business improvement districts, which are based on ownership, and the current one is based on ownership. But this was called Miracle on Broadway, and the city, through the redevelopment agency, started to do things like rebuilding the sidewalks, putting in decorative sidewalks, redoing the street lights, and putting banners in the area, and working with the merchants to merchandise the area, market the area, to try to get business back in there, recognizing that it was a district that largely served primarily the in-city Hispanic population, but could go beyond that with the right kind of marketing. It was easily accessible by transit, so a number of efforts were then made to try to link it to the transit system. One of the largest projects that was undertaken was the rehabilitation of the Grand Central Market and the surrounding buildings, which was...
the Bradbury building being one of them?
The Bradbury building was done almost in the same time frame. In fact, the Bradbury building was done first. I'll come back to the Bradbury building. But the Grand Central Market and the associated buildings, which included the building that historically had been the headquarters of the Metropolitan Water District, was one of the first efforts, recognizing that the office market in downtown was still very weak, to try to promote residential activity in downtown Los Angeles. And it was financed by a series of bonds that were tax-exempt bonds, which is one of the mechanisms available through the government to facilitate rehabilitation of buildings that are of historic merit, to provide financing both for a substantial portion of the building being made available as affordable housing, and wrapping in the rehabilitation of the retail activities that were in the Grand Central Market itself. plus putting some municipal services into some of the office space that was retained as office space, and then building the small park on Hill Street. That was an adjunct to the retail to provide the beginnings of an outdoor food court associated with the Grand Central Market. That financing was joint financing between the redevelopment agency and the MTA, tying into the fact that Grand Central Market was within walking distance of the new metro stop at 4th and Hill Streets. And so under the legislation, the federal legislation that had been changed in the mid-80s that severely restricted the ability to do much financing, we did put together a couple of packages working with the federal government to provide some exemptions within the federal law that enabled us to do this joint housing and transportation bond issue to facilitate the rehabilitation and the conversion of the Grand Central Market and the office building above it, the MWD building, into residential use. While this was going on, the city came to the Bradbury building and said, "You're a very attractive building, but doesn't meet fire code, doesn't meet seismic code, tear it down." And so we developed...
I think that was about the time they filmed Blade Runner.
Yeah, no, it was in the same time.
About the time they filmed Blade Runner.
And so the redevelopment agency stepped in and said, "We will make a loan," because the owners of the building, based on its then occupancy, could not get a commercial loan, for the rehabilitation, seismic upgrading, and fire safety installation to keep the Bradbury building from being torn down. And so a very substantial amount of money went into the Bradbury building, a much larger amount of money went into the Grand Central complex, and that became the anchor at the northern end of Broadway to begin to facilitate rehabilitation of a number of the buildings. One of the things that was learned by the experience of working with the codes of converting the Grand Central Market into residential use was that it was almost impossible to do under the city's codes. And so over the next several years, jointly with the Building and Safety Department, Planning Department, the Conservancy, and a number of others, we drafted legislation to simplify the process for conversion of buildings to residential use. The Adaptive Reuse Ordinance was adopted in 1999 that made it possible to bypass a lot of the regulations that existed primarily in the zoning code. They did not bypass anything in life safety, but bypassed many of the regulations in the zoning code, which primarily were requirements for parking, requirements for setbacks. If you have an existing building, there's no way you're going to shove it back 10 feet to get a front yard. The need for parking, as it turned out, was much, much less than the code required. Although it took many years to get the banks to the point where they were willing to accept buildings without parking in the downtown area. So CRA put together, since they had built a couple of garages, the primary ones being to serve the state office building, which was another major investment that redevelopment made on Spring Street to try to revitalize the northern end of the historic core, made parking available in that garage under a series of contracts with the developers of a number of the historic buildings to meet what the banks required, which was to say we had the amount of parking that would normally be required by code, even though the new code, the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance, did not require any parking other than whatever parking you happened to have for that building. If you had 12 spaces, that was your requirement. If you had no spaces, that was your requirement. The bank still required parking, so we did by contract agreements with those parking garages and those buildings to provide for meeting the bank requirement for parking. And that went on for about 6 years before the banks finally realized that parking was not necessary and began to finance these projects on their own. And then since then, it has taken off with hardly any additional public investment. But the primary kinds of carrots that were available were the Adaptive Reuse Ordinance, the ability to do tax-exempt financing, particularly for historic buildings, the use of the Mills Act, which is a financing mechanism that provides an alternate way of doing property taxes, which is a big advantage when you're doing a residential conversion, in particular a condominium conversion, because you can pass on a much lower tax basis to people who buy units. The construction of publicly financed parking, and by contract making that parking available to buildings that, for whatever reason, for other financing, needed to have parking available to them, plus contributing to it public improvements such as the reconstruction of the sidewalks and the upgrading of street lighting and other things of that nature. Now, the big stick that you have available to you always is you can fall back on the codes and say to an owner, if you don't cooperate, if you don't work to upgrade a building, work with the city, then we will bring the entire strength of the codes down on you. And that was primarily the stick that was used to try to get private participation in the reconstruction of the sidewalks on Broadway. We'll take a look at the Broadway sidewalks. But Broadway sidewalks sit on effect on a roof over basements that were built under the buildings and extended out, in many cases, to the original curb line of Broadway, which has moved a number of times since then. So in some cases, half the sidewalk, in some cases, the entire sidewalk sits on top of private property. These basements, over the course of 100 years of poor maintenance, were all collapsing. And so the sidewalks were starting to cave in. And this was a major safety hazard. The city said, we have to do something about it. We're willing to fill the sidewalks, fill the basements, put a new sidewalk on it, if you, property owner, will participate. And we offered them that we would fill it in. If they wanted the basement, they could pay for the basement, whatever the additional cost was. But if they didn't sign on to give us the right of entry, and we needed a right of entry because this was building on private property. If we were building in a public right-of-way, we could have done whatever we wanted to do. But since we're building on top of private property, in effect we were building on the roof of somebody's private lot, we needed their participation. So the stick was, you participate with us, you give us the right to move in there, we'll do most of the cost, or you don't sign on, we will cite you, and you will then be responsible for all of the cost in a time frame that we will establish for you. So that's the big stick, is you come in with the codes. The big carrot is the ability to use alternate codes that we have available. That's it.
Okay, one last thing. This is very good that we're going to go. Okay, you're very gifted. This is very good. I want to look ahead, just in general. I want you to talk about transfer floor area as a carrot. And if the city says, and let's make an assumption. Let's make an assumption that the city says we want to foster historic preservation on Broadway, and we want to use floor transfer area as a carrot.
Yep.
Go.
Okay. The city has within its code the ability to move what we call transferable floor area, which is every piece of property has an entitlement under the zoning to how much you can build on that site. In most of downtown, your entitlement is 6 times the size of the site. So if you have a 10,000-foot site, you're entitled to put 6 times that 60,000 feet of building on top of it. In certain circumstances, that can be increased to 13. And the city's intent is to try to get the highest density where the transit system is, Flower Street, Figueroa Street, and through Bunker Hill. And so the intent is to get the majority of the density there. One way of getting value back to the city is, instead of simply granting additional density under zoning on Bunker Hill or in the financial district, to say, you get it by taking unused density from buildings in the historic core that don't use their full entitlement. And the city manages the transaction between an owner of a building that is not fully using their density and a developer in the other part of downtown who wishes to build a larger building and to whom we want to encourage the larger building. This does a couple of things. One, it generates revenue that comes to the city. 2, it generates revenue that goes to the owner of that property, with the stipulation that that revenue be reinvested in the building. As part of the agreement, part of the transaction, is that whatever revenue goes back to the owner of the historic building gets reinvested. 3, and this is important, it takes away the potential value that an owner might see of tearing down a historic building to replace it with something bigger. Because the value can be captured by taking the density away and moving it elsewhere. And that preserves the integrity of the historic building.
Can that value be captured on an ongoing basis?
It's a one-time deal. Now, on a historic building, the city has the ability to grant a 25% bonus when you do a rehabilitation of the historic building. So air, we create some additional density that can be moved from a historic building. Bradbury Building has density that went to 6th and Figueroa Street. Grand Central Market had some excess density that went to the west side. There are a number of buildings on Broadway and on Spring Street where those transactions took place.
Questions?
Just spend one more second on this. As the city looks, as downtown really starts to come up to speed, what is the one thing that's going to make floor transfer area a good program? What is the one thing the city needs? And I think, and I'm just going to guess, I would imagine that's donor properties. So the city needs to identify property owners that are ready to do this transfer.
You know, the city owns a lot of density itself, and so the simplest thing from the city would be to simply take its own density. And most of the city's own density is at the convention center, which is a low-rise building on a piece of property that has mid-rise density on it. But signing up people who have excess density, particularly owners of buildings that are historically significant or have historic merit, provides another pool. And to the extent that that pool can be put at the head of the line, that's an important way of preserving the buildings in the historic district.
Good. Okay, good. Okay.
As this walking tour series continues, we're going to get people like, do you know Tom Rothman? Tom Rothman, who's a principal city planner. As the year progresses, we're going to get Tom Rothman to come in. The city of Los Angeles, the planning department, is about to completely revise the zoning code. And a lot of really interesting things are happening for downtown, for a downtown toolkit. And we're going to have Tom Rothman come in and give a talk just like this for about 20 minutes before we give a walk. So you can look forward to this. And without further ado, I want to hit the streets and start looking at old buildings. Are there any questions in general? Yes, Charlotte.
Question, how far south is the historic area extend? Just to right, like, a lot. I've seen a lot of interesting buildings.
Okay, Charlotte's asked a very good. Charlotte, you've asked a very good question. What are the boundaries for the National Register Historic District? And they are 3rd to Broadway, basically, a 3rd Street south to Broadway. No, Olympic. I'm sorry, 3rd to Olympic. Yeah, and that's the National Register, not south of Olympic. Okay. All right. So. Then why doesn't everyone go downstairs? I'm going to throw everything on the cart and wrap it up, and we'll start walking. And Gordon, you're kind of going to be in charge till I get downstairs in a couple minutes with the gear behind. And you Donald can sort of steer everyone till I get down there in a couple minutes. And then we'll just we'll walk up to the Spring Arcade, the Mercantile Arcade, and we'll start with there. And then where do you want your sidewalk talk to be exactly? We'll figure it out when we get there. Yeah.
It's perfect. Isn't he great? He knows a lot. Yes. He knows a lot. He knows a lot. Very gifted. The elevator's broken, and I packed my bag and realized the elevator was broken. I took 5 minutes. I'm so sorry.
Her too, Richard.
Let's go.
And you'd send everyone away because you wouldn't take any help.
I have to break it down again.
Nice.
That's okay. Okay, how's everyone doing? I'm gonna have a sip of tea.
What is the hashtag for this tour? For anyone using social media?
Social media for this tour. Broadway on my mind.
Hashtag.
One behind. All right, we're gonna talk about the Arcade Theater, the Cameo, and the Roxie. Basically, the next 3 buildings. To get us started, though, the Arcade Theater started as the Pantages, became the Arcade. Let's talk about this building for a second. I want to go back outside and look at this wonderful tympanum. But can everyone just from in here look at this beautiful terracotta molding? That's at the entranceway. We'll look at it more closely outside. But this is photograph on the wall. Yes.
Oh.
Thank you. We're going to go back outside and look at it across the street. Does everyone see the tympanum? This wonderful, it's not a triumphal arch, but it's a really wonderful monumental arch to this building. Gladding McBean is was the pottery that made this. They were 6 months behind on the commission, and the architect was very upset. The building opened in 1924. As I understand it, all those molds still exist. From what I understand, Gladding McBean at their Lincoln plant throws nothing away.
Coca-Colas were sold here in this building. Wow. Please come inside and buy a few Coca-Colas.
The Thamima. So as I understand it, you could just order, you could call Gladding McBean and get it's absolutely wonderful. It's really ornate. This building was, there's nothing in here, Donald. What happened?
So in the process,
I know. When we started giving tours down here back in 2006, 2007, this was a very crowded, very busy space. Mr. Helen, the owner, and his leasing team are, Donald, do you want to explain the reinvention that's happening here? I mean, they're really changing. I can answer.
Some of the history, which is kind of interesting. Mr. Helen is a Holocaust survivor.
Yes.
And after the Second World War, went to Australia, where he began investing in historic buildings and rehabilitating them. Came to Los Angeles, bought a number of historic buildings, came over to the redevelopment agency and said, I'd like to tear them down so I can build all new stuff here. And after many years, we worked out a deal with him that ultimately with the adaptive reuse ordinance, he decided that these towers would make a lot of sense to convert to residential. So there are office towers above both ends of the building. The arcade runs through the center of the block. It was originally a street before this building was put here. There's a picture of the street on the wall as well. So the building was built. It's a 3-story arcade with an office tower of 12 stories on each end that have since been converted into apartments. And the idea now is...
I think each tower has 96 something, about around 90, like yeah, around 90 units each tower.
And so the idea is now to reposition the retail to more reflect the new residents who are moving into downtown Los Angeles. Prior to that, this was a very active retail space, primarily for the Latino shoppers who frequented Broadway.
Do you think we could spend a minute talking about Broadway as a Latino economic engine? Because I know in the early 1980s, there was a lot of question about the Central Library and the notion of what to do with it. And there were studies done that showed Broadway was this tremendous economic engine in downtown.
Broadway was one of the strongest economic activity centers in the city of Los Angeles, primarily because it was the primary destination of the Latino shopper. And there were studies done that showed that the typical shopper came, was usually a female head of household with a couple of kids. They would come down here 2 or 3 times a week, and they would spend on average $40 to $45 a shopping trip in 1986 dollars. So it was a very active retail center. It was primarily that because it was very easy to access by transit. It's the hub of most of the bus lines, and these are primarily transit-dependent shoppers. So they would come here on a regular basis. Shopping activity was kind of a social activity as well, largely made up of families. The area having originally been developed as more of an upscale shopping and entertainment district, the original shop sizes were geared to traditional retail stores. And with the very high level of retail activity that was happening under the then current scenario, it made a whole lot more sense to cut the retail spaces into much narrower but deep shops that could be rented on a front foot basis. They were charged by the width of the space, not by the square footage that they occupied. And those front foot rates matched and on a number of occasions exceeded the ones in Rodeo Drive.
Wow.
That was the strength of the economic activity down there.
And so now, Mr. Helen has rehabilitated both structures. They're now residential. They're for rent. They're rental units.
The rental units.
And this arcade is being re-envisioned. Kim and you and I ran into Greg Martin not too long ago. He mentioned, well, I'll let this timer go by. Greg Martin mentioned 3 restaurants that are thinking about moving in. So this is a complete revisioning of this space. Yeah. Kelly Kubo, go ahead. Kelly Richardson.
She was first.
I was just going to say, this was first built as a...
In 1924, this was the top retail destination.
This was always a gallery.
It was a gallery of shops. It was modeled after the Burlington Arcade in Piccadilly in London, where Bertie Wooster of Wooster and Jeeves used to buy shirts. And there's a Yul Brynner film that the Burlington Arcade is featured in, and I can't remember the name.
The scale is different in the Burlington Arcade,
But,
though,
yeah.
but if you've ever visited it,
Kelly Richardson.
The businesses that were here were never short of customers. So,
That's right.
So, are they just not renewing the previous business owners' leases and then using that as an excuse, like, oh, you don't have any customers? We want a different demographic of customers.
I don't want to say anyone's done anything wrong, because I can't, because I'm not God. But there's been a real transition, and there's
Pretending those customers don't exist anymore, but they just want a different kind of customer.
I think that's a good way. I think that would be a good way to. The leasing agents have made a paradigm shift in what they're looking for here.
And this is partly driven by the fact you have 7,500 new residential units that are a much more scale population, all within walking distance.
And are there any complaints from the previous customers about that their stores are being relocated?
You know, I think KCRW's done some really nice pieces on owners on business owners that have left. They've done. Madeline Brand has come down and done some really nice pieces. I know that when Kim and I ran Art Walk, we had turned this into a performance art space at night, thanks entirely to Greg Martin and Mr. Helens letting us do that. And one of the things the performance art troupe did was make a documentary about all the business owners that were here in 2009, and it's pretty interesting. And I personally, this breaks my heart to see this space empty. Okay, I find it very hard to see this space empty. I really do. I mean, we used to come in here, and you couldn't do this. You couldn't talk in here. I would get back on the bus if it were a bus tour, or we'd go back out onto Spring Street. But it's a new thing to be able to talk and be heard in here. And
So he may or may not have made a good business decision, and
time will tell. That's right. We will see. Downtown.
I understand it's like classic gentrification. That's what you were describing. But the good news is there's lots of shopping, you know, on other streets. It's not as though everything's gone, but it's...
And also, you know, the engine, Latino economic engine has changed dramatically. I am not a huge fan of bringing back Broadway, because I don't think they do a very good job of sharing their statistics, and they are a public entity. But what they have shared and what they have shown is that the Latino Hispanic shopping populations have moved to places like Pacific Boulevard in Huntington Beach, which is a great shopping center, and places like Plaza Mexico in Linwood. And so Broadway really, I mean, this is what's happening on Broadway is a reaction to changing focuses and where people go shopping. It's not just leasing agents have made some decisions, it's populations have made really serious changes about where they shop. And Plaza Mexico and the revival of Pacific Boulevard has had a big impact in a negative way on Broadway. And I love Pacific Boulevard. I think Pacific Boulevard is absolutely fantastic.
So are there any of what we see is anything original or historic?
The paint, I mean, the storefronts have changed, but this is it.
All those
all the detailing is original. You know, you have a tower at Broadway, and you have a tower at Spring, and you have this glazed 3-story arcade in the middle. And this is the railing is probably but the detailing, I mean, why don't we walk it? I'm just, why don't we walk it? Okay, so we have two pictures.
this building?
Right. So we have two pictures here. The picture on the left is what we're going to see when we cross the street. That's basically opening day 1925, right? And the picture on the right is Mercantile Place, which is a street that's one street long that was here before the arcade was built. What's interesting is that the two men that financed this building wanted to build one on Hill Street between Hill and Olive because it's a pedestrian shortcut. And it really, I mean, the brilliance of this building and the reason we wanted to make this a locus for Art Walk is Broadway and Spring in 21st century context are two very different worlds in downtown. And this building connects Broadway, the Latino world of downtown, and Spring Street, the up-and-coming world, the upwardly mobile world of downtown. And so this stretch here is very important. And I really wish the two financiers had financed another building on Hill and Olive. I think it would have been very interesting.
So they took those buildings were taken down.
Those buildings were demolished. Yeah, they bought them. You know, Donald, I don't know anything how this. It was the late teens. I think they probably just bought them.
They bought the property.
Yeah, the property owners just bought the properties.
And the city gave them the right to build over the street.
Yeah, right. And there was a deal with the city that obviously took a year or two. Probably took a little time, but they made a land bridge. And I guess there's loss of revenue, so there might have been a. I know that St. Vincent's Court, which is off of 7th Street, between Broadway and Hill, that they still pay a monthly fee to the city for that airspace for the bridge. Yes.
So probably when this was built, it was its own form of gentrification.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This building in 1924 was probably its own form of gentrification. Sure, all those shops were displaced. Yeah. All those shop owners had to find new shops. And I want to remind you, in 1920, the Biola University Board thought that downtown was almost too expensive to build in. It was commonly felt in 1920 that it was too expensive to buy property downtown. So, a lot of busts. And Gordon?
I would point out too that back in the earlier days, this was a transition between the upscale shopping theater district and the financial district.
Yeah.
Over here.
Yeah. Why don't we walk the length? I'm just going to stay here and have a sip of water, but just walk the length and come back, and then we'll talk about the theaters. Or ask me questions. Right now, we love these movies. Everyone is everyone is told here are 3 sets. You have problems. Okay, so isn't this a great space? It breaks my heart. It's so vacant. It breaks my heart. It breaks my heart. So one important thing about a sub-theme to everything we talk about is positive public space. And one of the things that downtown used to have more than any other neighborhood, I think, in Los Angeles, or had for the longest time, was positive public space. A lot of people downtown doing a lot of things. And if storefronts are empty, people just don't come through. So this is very hard for me to see. And the longer these storefronts are vacant, the longer it's going to take to activate anything. It's very sad. Let's go outside.
So how long?
I don't know.
At what point did people start leaving?
You know, about 2010. About 2010, I think they started.
But conceptually, it's the same thing that's going on at Grand Central.
Don't even start me on Grand Central Market.
I have one thing to say about Grand Central Market.
Grand Central Market drives me crazy.
A market that has one butcher shop is not a market; it's a boutique. That's all I have to say.
Okay, so Grand Central Market. So let me give you 30 seconds on Grand Central Market. Okay. So if you take away economy meat, which has been there, Gordon, since what, 1950, which was there since 1955, which you remember shopping at with your mother. If you take away economy meat, the people that go get their mole from the mole shop, if they can't get the oxtail bones to make their soup with, why are they going to go get mole? If you take away all the building blocks that the Latino community needs to make their weekly ritual food that they make, right? If you take that all away, where's the community going to go? They're not going to go to the mole shop in Grand Central because they can't get the oxtails for the soup. So they're going to go somewhere else, and you just break. I mean, it's gut-wrenching. There's no good answer. I'm happy there's a good cheese shop in Grand Central Market. I am. I think it's good. But what? They had to kick out the economy meat? I don't know. I'm not making these decisions. I'm glad. I'll be honest with you.
You're not glad.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm not making these decisions.
Oh, no.
They're hard decisions. I don't know. But it's really sad. What's happening at Grand Central is really tough. A lot of change at Grand Central. You know, I could give you a list of 20 things you used to get at Grand Central that you can't get anymore. And Gordon, maybe this is a good time for you to talk about effective ownership, just for a second. So the notion that, well, Adele Yellen owns Grand Central Market, or runs the entity, the limited liability corporation that owns Grand Central, and Adele Yellen owns it, there is effective ownership by the community of a space, Gordon.
Well, it's all about who gets to make the decisions about what happens to the community. Is it the property owners? Is it the city? Is it the community that lives in the area? And effective ownership is the ownership that the community, not the property owners, but the people who live there have. They have an ownership stake in what happens in a community. And a great example of that is I own Angel's Flight. Because I grew up there and I rode Angel's Flight every day when I was a kid. And there was a particular seat on Angel's Flight that's my seat. That's effective ownership.
Okay, right. So these are right. You know, we're going to talk more about carrots and sticks, and these are carrots and sticks with property owners. But there's really not a lot of dialogue about carrots and sticks with the community. And I think that's the one thing missing in all of this.
There needs to be a stick to get these stores open again.
Okay. Well, you know, I think Greg, I assure you Greg Martin 12 times a day says, let's get these stores open, okay? I promise you, every hour he's worrying about the business, he says a prayer to get these businesses open. I don't think they're not. It's very complicated. Let's go outside. Let's cross the street. I want to talk about the Pantages, the Cameo, and the Roxie. Donald, you want to do the sidewalks last, or do you have to go? Do you want to do the sidewalks now? Okay, so let me do the theaters. It won't take more than 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll do the sidewalks. So let's just go outside, and we're going to cross it. We're going to talk about it. Mr. Allen's doing a great job on that. Okay, so I have some photos to show on the tablet, so don't worry. What I want to say quickly, the building we're standing in front of, Schulte United, this is 1918. I think it's really interesting. A lot of commercial buildings, these classic Beaux-Arts buildings like the one we're standing in front of, they're converting all the upper floors to lofts, and I think that's a really great use for these buildings. A lot of the commercial buildings on Broadway were built as storage for the top floors, and I think they make great loft spaces because they're lofts, and I think that there's a pretty good market for people to come in and take over these lofts, and I think it's a pretty straightforward conversion. They just, the space is open, they have the structural piers that they have, and they just, okay. Donald, how great is it to see spaces above the ground floor open on Broadway? It's so great to see property owners
taking out the permits, cleaning up the upper floors, and renting them for anything.
Right. And for a long time, it was not economic to do that, given the rents that they could get on the ground floor.
Right. Oh, like for instance, so let's look at this door, right? Yeah. So this door right here. Let's look at this door. Kim, cut to the door. Go take a picture of the door.
Cutting to the door.
Cut to the door. So, Donald's been talking about this. I've been mentioning it. 1987, you get so much per square foot, rivaling Rodeo Drive. Front foot. So the notion of wasting space on a door that goes up to the second through sixth floors, it's a waste. You're losing revenue.
Especially when you had no real tenants interested in that upper space.
They could go through a service elevator from the alley.
If you had a tenant at all.
Right, right.
Yeah. And for the most part...
Ostensibly, the fire marshal would be happy to know you could access the upper floors of your building.
The fire marshal would also want you to put in fire sprinklers.
Right.
Because the buildings didn't have them if you were going to occupy them. So there were very few rents available that would justify the investment in upgrading the upper floors, given the revenue you could get just by renting that part, that entry
what?
space.
That's that's 13, 15.
Yeah, 15.
Oh, 15 feet wide. Yeah.
Yeah. Given what you could get from rent by putting a little retail outlet in it, and so it made no sense for many years to do anything with the upper floors.
But now
the market is there for the use of the upper floors.
And the tenants have to get in.
Yeah. That's why when the upper floors started to be reoccupied, it was the buildings that had entrances on the side streets that were the first ones to convert.
Interesting. Very interesting.
They didn't have to take away any of the retail space on Broadway.
Very interesting. All right, let's talk about, this is the arcade theater right behind me, the tall one, right next to the Mercantile Arcade. So this opened up September 26, 1910. It's the first Pantages theater. Alexander Pantages. First Pantages theater. And I have a photograph of the inside I'll show you on the tablet. Actually, Alexander Pantages leased the place. So this is a photograph. I'll just pass this around. Yep. We'll get to that. Okay. I'll answer the question if that's still in there in a minute. So this is what Pantages looks like. I'll come around, don't worry.
Pantages.
Yeah, you can see the Pantages.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what it looked like. Charlotte, did you see Martin? I know. No.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
It's going to be a saturation.
Donald, help me on this again. So, the movie theater for the vaudeville house, Pantages opened as live theater. The Pantages opens as live theater. A number of these, the Clune has some live theater. By the mid 1920s, there are very few. The only vaudeville house is on Hill. It became the at 8th and Hill, across from Hamburgers. So all these theaters, these live theaters, get converted to projection to show films. So by 1990, basically all 12 theaters have closed. Metropolitan Theaters is the major leaseholder for most of the theaters on Broadway, and by 1990, they've sold all of the leases, and they're no longer showing films
and the theaters are gutted. What?
I think it was a little later. I think
by 1990, there were maybe 2 or 3 theaters. Of 12 theaters by 1990, 80% of them had closed. It was the death knell. So what happens, and what's happened in the Cameo, the Roxie, and the original Pantages, they're flea markets. They've just gone in, they've taken out the seats, they use it as storage. Some of it's storage, some of it's retail, but they're gutted. Nothing's preserved, and the balconies are empty. It's very, very sad. And this is so fundamental a challenge, I don't know what's going to happen. Donald, do you have any thoughts on?
Well, one thing to note is, once the city got involved, at least they worked with them.
The city got involved with Miracle on Broadway with Tom Bradley, mid-1980s. 86.
But once we got involved with the theaters, we required that they leave the original sloped floor and put a false floor above it if they were converting it, so that at some point you could pull that back out and you would have them slope
the rake.
Put it back into theater use. And then ultimately the idea is to try to get some of them back as theater uses. The more difficult ones are the large ones. We have theaters that have 2,000, 2,400 seats in them.
The $1 million, the Orpheum is a success story. The Los Angeles is, the Orpheum is pretty small. The Los Angeles Theater is big. The Los Angeles is 1,800, I think. And the Los Angeles is across from Figaro.
The State is
the State is at 7th and Broadway. The State is 2,400, I think. I think 2,400. So the State is currently being leased out to a church, but that lease is up in 2 years, I think. So.
And the United Artists is now being redone as part of the Ace Hotel.
And that's
Donald, do you, right, the Ace is really interesting. We've been talking exclusively about adaptive reuse on Broadway, starting with Ira Yellen, before there were laws, spending probably $500,000 on attorney fees to convert a commercial structure into a residential. But what we haven't talked about in the Ace Hotel, which is at 9th and Broadway and just opened 9 months ago, is an important example of adaptive reuse commercial to commercial. See, the United Artists building, better known as the Texaco building, which is a theater surrounded by a thin wall of offices, which were leased to Texaco, is now a hotel. And that's really interesting, that you take an office building and convert it to a hotel. And I think that's the future on Broadway.
Are they turning the theater back into a theater?
The theater is a theater, and the theater is the United Artists, which is at 9th and Broadway.
It was a church.
You've talked about Third and Broadway. Maybe we can talk about Reverend Gene Scott and the Los Angeles University. Gene Scott. Will you help me on this with Church of the Open Door? Will you let me talk about Church of the Open Door?
Right ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. You can talk about Church of the Open Door.
Okay, so
I took down the old one.
Yeah. Church of the Open Door was built in 1912, 6th and Hope. 2,400 seat auditorium. Biola University was built as part of it. The church took up one half.
What Biola stands for?
Biola stands for Bible Institute of Los Angeles.
Right.
So Lyman Stewart, founder of Union Oil, goes ahead and says, I want to bring out the most important Pentecostal minister, evangelical minister in the country, and build him a church and put a Bible school next to it. 6th and Hope. Beautiful Romanesque revival, twin towers. Half of the upper floors are for the Bible students to live in. The other half of is just a church, and the other half that's not residential are teaching spaces for the Bible school. The 87 earthquake takes it out. The 1987 earthquake renders this structure uninhabitable. Biola had left the structure in 55, 56. Biola University officially separates from the church and moves to La Mirada. And that space where Biola was becomes a residency hotel. Church of the Open Door is then purchased, kind of, sort of, almost, by Gene Scott because he gives them a suitcase with $20,000 in it. He gives them a suitcase with money in it. Maybe there was 20,000, maybe there was nothing, but there was a suitcase with money. That was never escrow. That was never considered entering escrow.
This happened in a hotel room.
No one entered escrow, and the CRA sort of laughed at the thought of someone buying that building because it was condemned. Right. So you couldn't actually go into escrow over that building because no one was going to inhabit it ever again.
So he tried.
He tried, and because Miracle on Broadway started in '86, Tom Bradley, the mayor, and Ed Kelsey of Metropolitan Theaters, which is leasing almost all the theaters on Broadway at this point. Ed Kelsey goes to Reverend Gene Scott, my hero, and says, "We'd really like for you to take up a lease on the United Artists Theater," which was built by the United Artists, opened in '28, Mary Pickford, Charlie Chaplin, Douglas Fairbanks, gorgeous theater. Forget about Church of the Open Door. The building's gone. You're not going to save it. You could sue the city for the next 20 years. You're never going to enter the building, and it'll be torn down before you get a court date. So here, but we want to offer you a lease, and you can even buy the United Artists, and they make him a very good lease. And eventually, soon there's a deal to sell at some point, a couple of years after he moves in. So Gene Scott moves in the United Artists, and he saves it. I mean, it's just gorgeous. And now the Ace Hotel has turned it into a concert venue.
Kudos to Metropolitan Theaters for putting that deal on because it did clear the way to take down the other building without controversy.
So that was done by just Metropolitan Theaters?
They entered the conversation, kind of at the city's behest, and were willing to make available the building they had on Broadway. Obviously, they weren't doing anything with it, so this was an opportunity for them to get revenue. But it also was a way to get out of the potential for litigation over the other building.
Gene Scott was really upset. He wanted Church of the Open Door. He was threatening litigation with the city. He was really adamant.
But this Metropolitan Theater Group that has the word theater in their name, they mostly run these buildings that are mostly now.
Well, they did it.
Let's step back. Let's step back. Miracle on Broadway was a very informal public-private partnership with the City of Los Angeles, spearheaded by the mayor. The Community Redevelopment Agency was a big player in it, and several other principal stakeholders on Broadway, private property owners, were involved. Metropolitan Theaters was one of them. And working with the Office of the Mayor and the CRA, Ed Kelsey, who owned the Metropolitan, went to Gene Scott and said, "We want to make you a deal. Forget about Church of the Open Door." And that's what happened.
But I'm asking about like the whole. You said they owned
Metropolitan Theaters by 1990 had let go of most of the leases. By 1990, most of the theaters had been closed. Metropolitan had let go of them.
They reverted to private owners.
Someone else bought. Right? They reverted. The leases ended, and the property owners had them. And what you see now has gone in.
One other quick question. Is there any theater on Broadway that is in pristine, mothballed condition?
United Artists. United Artists.
No, I thought you said they just started using that.
Yes, you're correct. Unused? No.
No. So that was...
United Artists was... Gene Scott kept it immaculate.
Yeah. United Artists is in very good condition.
Very good.
The Orpheum
is in
great.
But the Orpheum's had a lot of work. Right. United Artists has had work, but Steve Needleman did a lot of work in the
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the theaters are getting a lot of work, but the United Artists is immaculate. It just absolutely jaw-dropping gorgeous. Okay.
We actually went to services there once. It was not easy to get in, so we did it, and it was beautiful then. So the UA, I'm glad they're using it, but they didn't.
Okay. Let's talk about the Clune. Okay, let's talk about the Clune. The Cameo. Okay, so the Cameo is right in back of me, right? It's the little two-story with the pediment. Okay. So this was all just office space. Right. So a word on theater and office spaces in the same building. Construction technology before World War II was such that
if you built a theater in a space, there was no way to span the theater and put offices above it. So everything you see are these thin walls. So the United Artists,
what you could build from the street would be the entrance to the theater,
right.
the ticket area, the concession area, and the theater portion was set back.
Right.
And an office structure in many cases
right there
was
on
put
the street.
over top,
right.
A very narrow one, but was put over top of the entrance and concession area. And then the
right.
theaters, which in many cases were 4 to 6 stories tall,
yeah.
incorporate
and went all the way back.
Yeah.
So this is a very thin wall. So this wall of offices over the original Pantages, it's just really one or two.
It's like 2 rooms thick.
2 rooms thick, because you can't span the vault of the theater. The technology, it was just prohibitively expensive to fill a solid wall of occupiable space over the theater. You just could. Right, you couldn't do it. Okay, so this opened as Clunes in 1910, and it opened with movies. Okay, so this is not a theatrical house. It opened with films, and it opened as Billy Clunes, and here's a photo of opening day in November of 1910. So they opened showing movies. I think I have it in my notes. Yeah. Next theater in my notes. So this is Clunes on opening day.
Well, a good sandblasting would probably make a big
yeah.
Oh, it might dissolve.
Yeah. Now Mr. Helen owns the Cameo too. Wow. Because there's an ad for leasing his. Yeah. So perfect. So that's Cameo.
Sorry, bye.
Okay, so these are 2 of the earliest theaters on Broadway, the Cameo and the Arcade, and the last theater built on Broadway is the Roxy, 1932.
Yeah,
okay, this is the last theater built. The Los Angeles is the second to last. The Los Angeles opened at the end of 1930. The Los Angeles Theater is across the street from Figaro. And this opened in 32, and that was it. They stopped building movie
theaters. They had enough theaters, come on.
They did. Let me look at my notes. The Roxy.
That is so great.
The Rock is such a great facade, I know.
It has a
And I love that little green path. I don't know why some of it's green, but it's very cool.
Admission, 10 cents for the top floors, 15 cents for the mezzanine, and lodge seats are 20 cents. Opening day at the Clune Theater.
What was the movie?
I don't have it. I don't have it. All right, so the Roxy is 1932. The Roxy's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. I love the Roxy. And I do have.
And it was always.
It was.
Some of these have changed names over the years.
Yeah, it's always been the Roxy. Yeah, it's always been the Roxy.
Going out of business now. I guess they lost their lead.
Some places always are going out of business.
Yeah.
Well, that's how when the book city announced.
Okay, the opening. So it opened as a picture house, but they did have performances in between shows. And on opening day, November 23, 1932, the featured singer was Etta Edson and her all-girl orchestra. They were there. She was the act that they would show between films. And here is the interior from the top, from the balcony of the Roxy. Yeah, absolutely gorgeous.
And how well preserved is it?
Oh, got it.
Oh.
No, no, the Roxy's just. These are all messes. And Mr. Helen is great. Mr. Helen, they've, all these changes have happened with his complicence, So, I don't know what to do with these theaters.
Oh,
no one knows what to do with these theaters.
Ask the ghosts. They have the
ghosts, that's right.
Really
okay.
Amazing.
So the problem is that no one knows what to do with these theaters. So the biggest problem. Okay, so let's talk about last remaining seats for a minute, and then Donald, are you ready for the sidewalks in a minute? Let me just talk about last remaining seats. So The biggest problem with showing movies on Broadway, up until about 6 months ago, there was no dedicated archival quality projection on Broadway. Last Remaining Seats, which is a very successful, long-time program by the Los Angeles Conservancy, Last Remaining Seats functions solely because 6 projectionists, who Kim and I are friends with, agreed to do it. They love old movies, they're projectionists, they have huge collections of archival quality projectors, and they just love to do it, and they do it. Okay, if these 6 men decided not to do it, Last Remaining Seats would come to a grinding halt. Not trying to be dramatic, but literally. Then I guess about 6 months ago, Adele Yellen put an archival quality projector in the $1 Million Movie. So the $1 Million Movie is now able to rent films from studios, archival quality prints, and show them, which is really important, okay? That's just happened in the last 6 months. And so the ability to show films on Broadway at these theaters has been, it's hard. It's very, very, anyway. All right, Donald, Sidewalks. We've been waiting, thank you.
I started to say earlier, most of the sidewalks are on top of basements, and the basements have been caving in. If you look over at the sidewalk beneath us, there are some vestiges here of where there used to be glass blocks.
Yeah.
That provided some light into the basement areas. Some of them were retail, most of them were storage.
Still live?
But these were originally glass blocks in the sidewalk that allowed light to penetrate. The basements, in most cases, came out some distance from the building. Given that there's kind of a crack line right here, this is probably where the edge of the basement is.
Should I quit standing on it?
No, it's right now you're on the bridge.
Oh, now it's worse.
Thank you. So some private owners did go back and put concrete over to try to stabilize it from the top. In many cases, there were gates that allowed access to the basements. You see, they're also caving in, so people have put asphalt to try to fix on a temporary basis dealing with it. But in general, the sidewalks have all been collapsing. The city decided that it really needed to do something about it and put together a program to try to rebuild the sidewalks. The big complication again being that they were almost all on private property except for maybe a 5-foot strip by the curb that has utility chases in it and needed to have private property owners agree before they could put any investment into the reconstruction. So worked out plans for a number of blocks. Because of it ended up being much more expensive than was ever anticipated. So it was actually only carried out on 2 blocks, 3rd and 5th Street.
Do you want to stand down here so we can all kind of get off the sidewalks? Do you mind?
Sure.
Thanks.
Easier to stand on the side.
Thank you.
So there have been some temporary fixes made in a number of places, but the sidewalks between 5th Street and 3rd Street have been rebuilt. And so we go up to 5th Street to see what the new sidewalks look like. Historically, many of the sidewalks used a smaller grid than the city standard grid, so the concrete shape tends to be smaller. That was replicated in the sidewalks that were done further up the street to try to retain the historic nature. In a number of places, the owners decided they still wanted to have access, so new access grates were put in, and in very few instances the glass blocks were rebuilt. But very few of those were retained.
Are they quite expensive, or
very expensive to rebuild?
to buy the glass blocks? Really?
Yeah, because well the
infrastructure that holds up the glass blocks is expensive.
Yeah, and putting in sufficient structure to resist water penetration, because that's what undid most of the deck. If we go up to the next block, you can see what the new sidewalk structure looks like and the improved situation. That
all right, let's go. We'll follow you. Great, I love it.
I never realized that's what we were walking on. That's so interesting.
Why we're here. Here, talk about the sidewalk.
So is there a bit of sidewalk you will not walk on in this?
There's right down at 16 Broadway on this side.
The big hole.
Yeah, see, this is a temporary patch.
Right. We can see a little glass poking out of that one. Look at that. Check it out, everyone.
Yep, there's glass block.
Yeah, here's some of the glass block, and this has just been covered over with asphalt as a temporary patch. And even the asphalt's falling through.
That's good. Do you bite?
Okay, we're all here. Thank you.
Okay. All right. This is an alternative. This was done privately. This was not part of the city project. But the private owners of this building, after the city had done the 2 blocks north, seeing that the glass blocks were caving in, decided they were going to redo their sidewalk. And the agreement was, because the Conservancy got involved trying to get them to preserve the block, in fact replace the block, was that they would keep the pattern of the block but put filler stones in rather than putting glass in. So it appears in the same format dimension of what originally was the glass block, but they chose not to put the glass block into it.
So Donald, how hard has it been to get the city to repave 2 blocks of Broadway?
It took, to get all of the permits and all of the clearances, because there was federal money involved, state money involved, and city money involved, and it's an historic district. It took 6 years to get all of the permits, and it took 2.5 years to rebuild the sidewalks in those 2 blocks, because they had to be done in small sections so that every business could continue to operate while it was being done. So you could do a stretch up to halfway into a doorway, and then finish that, and then take the other half out and rebuild that.
Wow.
So the reconstructed one starts on the other side of the street. So
wow.
Cross over and
let's go. 6. Wow.
Oh, we got nothing but time.
For bureaucrats have nothing but time. That's their job. Their job is to see processes through. That's correct. Oh, look at that.
So this is new sidewalk.
Why don't we leave a walkway over there?
So this is where the new sidewalk starts, and it continues north for 2 blocks, and we can go as far as people want to go. Part of it was to install street markers at the key intersections, so South Broadway on this side, 5th Street around the corner, similarly at the other corners. To maintain the historic pattern, the small square dimensions were put into the sidewalk. Because that's non-standard, even the city had to grant a special permit to allow us to do a non-standard sidewalk, because just the dimension of the block.
But that was what the original sidewalk?
That was typical of the original sidewalks on the street. Now you also notice this little piece of metal that goes along here. And put back in, but that indicates the property line.
Right. So this side of the street is public.
This is private. Yeah, and they're required to keep this available as part of the public sidewalk, although it's private property. Now the line where the private property is varies from building to building. This particular one is very clearly marked. And a lot of them it's not marked because when they were done. It was granted the city easement. But you can generally figure them out, except where we built them, by where there are cracks and subsidence in the sidewalk as to where a basement ended.
So does this line, this metal thing zigzag around, depending on the building?
This particular property kept it. Not all the properties kept it. But there are legal ramifications to that. They theoretically have the right at some point, the city will not let them, to take this back and claim it as private property. Because they mark it and they say that somewhere there's a sign that says that it's permissive use, 2 people to occupy it, and once every 10 years they come out and block it, they retain their rights to take it back. As I say, the city won't let it do anything but sidewalk on it.
So Donald,
yeah.
Why parking on Broadway now?
Was not my idea. I would not have done that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, looking at all the changes that have been happening on Broadway because of the passing of the Broadway Master Streetscape Plan last year, they've started to do a lot of temporary work, which is temporary.
Yeah.
Given what you've just described to us, how hard is it going to be if CD14 wants to go ahead and do some actual reconfiguring of sidewalks on Broadway? It's going to be pretty hard.
I think at this point, you know, they don't change it. We had spent a lot of money putting in brick crosswalks, but they've now painted over.
Spent a lot of money putting in what? I'm sorry.
Say again?
What did you say?
We spent a lot of money putting brick sidewalks, crosswalks in, and they were a nice brick sidewalk, and the city just painted them. And this one, until they finalize the plan for the streetcar, there aren't going to be a whole lot of anything but temporary improvements done.
Right.
And then the whole design of what happens to the sidewalks will follow the decision about doing the streetcar, not doing the streetcar. If they do the streetcar, is it in the center of the street? Is it off center? Because that will change the grades. The ideal situation would be to eliminate the curbs that you currently have, put in some other type of barrier that is more movable, that allows people to flow out to wherever the streetcar is and reduce the use of the street for traffic.
Right.
So you'd maintain probably a bus lane and a place for loading and unloading. I would check the parking off again and put the sidewalk in. Put the streetcar in.
Right. Historically, Broadway's been a corridor for buses. There's been a lot of work for the surface of the street for buses.
Right. Yeah, the concrete bus lanes were put in there several years ago. With the idea that this was going to be a very important bus corridor.
And it has been up until very recently.
Yeah, when they started moving buses off of Broadway when they put the parking back.
Okay. Does anyone have any questions for Donald? Very smart.
I want to see a little further up. Are there actual glass block restorations?
I think there's, if I remember, there's a glass block restoration near the Bradbury building.
Ah.
Yeah.
And,
we don't have time to go up to the Bradbury, but you can go on your own.
Yeah. And I don't think we did any on the Grand Central side.
Boy, this is amazingly complex project and procedure.
Right.
The street is a big hub, probably for
All right. Well, I think we're gonna wrap it up. I think we've.
Where was the building where you were in the video with the bachelder tiles?
Yeah, that's close.
I just want to know where it is.
Oh, it's on 6th, 271 West 6th Street. It's on 6th between Broadway and Spring. And I tried to get them to keep it open today, but they wouldn't.
There'll be a metal grate pulled down.
The chocolate shop, yeah. We'll
bachelder tiles. Huh?
Maybe in October for the walking tour, we'll get Charlie to open it again. Yeah, we'll try and get Charlie to open it again for us in October. It's a beautiful space. And there's a big article about it on Curbed about, what, 3 weeks ago, Kim? Yeah.
Is it going to get reused, the space?
I don't know. He's fighting with Mr. Allen.
It would be great to put some kind of food.
It would be great.
And what's going on with Clifton?
Kim, what's going on with Clifton's?
They're working on it. It's been 3 years.
They're working on it.
I know.
We're waiting.
Because from the outside, it's still, you can't really tell what, if anything.
I guess it'll probably open.
Are they busy inside?
I have no idea. They'll open up.
I know they're working on it.
Yeah. They'll open up. Clifton's will open. I just don't know. All right, well, I want to thank everyone. Hashtag for this for social media, Broadway on my mind. We'll be back next month. My friend Nathan will be back and we'll do more Robert Brown Young. Everyone thank Donald.
Oh, Donald. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Donald is very gifted. He knows an incredible amount. And if you want to ask him questions, now Donald, you're teaching at USC?
Yes.
You're teaching public policy?
Planning and economic development.
Yeah. Good. That's a good job for you. Yeah. Are you at City Hall still a little bit? A little bit? For your neighborhood?
Once a week, yeah.
Oh, good. Okay.
For various projects.
Good. All right.
You're retired from the city.
Yes.
Ask him questions, ask me questions. I'm going to put my tablet away. I want to thank everyone. We'll see you next month. We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is also the pharmacy with the sexiest worker in the world. I go visit her like every twice a week.
Let's have some marketing.
Downtown L.A.
Put that on the map. Let's put it on the